Listen, baby, ain't no mountain high.
Soul music gave us some of the most beautiful sounds the world has ever heard. Voices that turned heartbreak into something you could dance to. But behind a lot of those voices was a story the charts never told. Betrayed by the people closest to them. Used up by an industry that moved on without them.
I want you to listen to this song right here from me. Got to tell you I feel like.
Today, we're counting down 10 R&B legends from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, whose final days were as devastating as their music was unforgettable.
I've been so many places in my life and time.
Every story here is real, every death documented, every song available right now for you to go hear. Number one is one of the most heartbreaking endings in music history. Let's get into it. Number 10, Clyde McPhatter.
It's a lover's question.
Before there was a Smokey Robinson, before there was a Jackie Wilson, there was Clyde McPhatter.
Should I worry when we're apart?
His high tenor voice, soaked in gospel from singing in his father's church choir, became the blueprint for modern R&B singing. As the lead voice of Billy Ward and his Dominoes, he sang on Have Mercy Baby.
Like to know when she's not with me.
Then he did something almost no one in the industry did back then. He walked away from a hit group to build his own. That group became the Drifters.
Does she feel just what I feel and how?
With Clyde out front, they cut Money Honey and Such a Night. Songs so big they shaped the entire sound of 1950s rhythm and blues. He went solo not long after, and his single, A Lover's Question, became one of the defining ballads of the era.
Am I to know it's really real?
By his mid-20s, Clyde McPhatter wasn't just a star. He was the template every smooth-voiced soul singer after him would copy. Then the hits stopped coming.
It's a lover's question. I'd like to know.
By the 1960s, the sound was changing, and Clyde wasn't changing with it. He bounced from label to label, MGM, then Mercury, chasing a comeback that never landed.
I'd like to know when we're.
He moved to England for 2 years, hoping a fresh audience would revive him. It didn't. He came home in 1970 quieter, heavier, and drinking far more than anyone around him wanted to admit.
It's really real. Oh, tell me what.
In an interview not long before he died, a journalist asked him about his fans. Clyde's answer was simple and devastating. I have no fans.
Are in her eyes.
On June 13th, 1972, in New York, Clyde McPhatter died in his sleep. He was just 39 years old. Years of heavy drinking had quietly destroyed his heart, his liver, and his kidneys all at once.
I'd like to know when.
The man whose voice trained an entire generation of soul singers died broke, forgotten by the industry he helped build. 15 years before the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would finally induct him, not once, but twice.
Oh, tell me where the answer.
Number 9, Florence Ballard.
I've got this yearning, burning, yearning for you.
Before Diana Ross was the face of the Supremes, there was Florence Ballard. It was Florence who actually started the group. It was Florence who picked the name Supremes off a list. And in those early years, it was Florence's powerful voice that the other girls built their sound around.
Stings like a bee, baby, but now.
Then Motown made a decision that would haunt Florence for the rest of her life. Berry Gordy pushed Diana Ross to the front as lead singer, and Florence, the woman who built the group, got pushed to the background, harmonizing on her own creation. By 1967, at the absolute height of the Supremes' fame, Florence was fired from the group she founded. She tried a solo career with ABC Records. It didn't work.
Where did our love go?
By 1971, her husband had left her, her home was foreclosed on, and the woman who'd once sung for sold-out arenas and a presidential inaugural ball was filing for welfare in Detroit.
I've got a yearning.
The newspapers picked up the story, and Florence Ballard, founding Supreme, became a national symbol of how badly the music industry could chew up the people who built it. She fought back. She got treatment for alcoholism.
Ooh, deep inside me.
In 1975, an insurance settlement gave her enough money to buy a small home and reunite with her husband. There was even talk of a real comeback. It never happened.
But now that you got
On February 21st, 1976, Florence checked into Mount Carmel Mercy Hospital, complaining that her arms and legs had gone numb. The next morning, at just 10:05 a.m., her heart stopped. A blood clot had traveled straight to her heart. She was 32 years old. It would be 12 more years before the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame finally inducted her, making Florence Ballard the first woman ever posthumously honored that way. Number 8, Little Willie John. Before Peggy Lee, before Elvis, before Madonna. The song Fever belonged to a 5'4" singer out of Detroit named Little Willie John. He was barely 18 years old when he recorded it in 1956, and it shot straight to number 1 on the R&B charts, selling over 1 million copies.
Listen to me.
He followed it with hit after hit. Talk to me, need your love so bad, sleep. A young James Brown spent years opening shows for him, studying his every move on stage.
Say, no one can love you the way.
Little Willie John wasn't just popular, he was, by every account, one of the most electrifying live performers of his generation. But that same fire that made him magnetic on stage made him dangerous off of it.
Take these arms down there.
He had a short temper, a deep insecurity about his height, and a serious drinking problem that got worse as the hits dried up in the early 60s.
And fever all through the night.
In October 1964, after a gig in Seattle, an altercation at an after-hours party turned fatal. Little Willie John stabbed a man, and the charge was eventually reduced to manslaughter.
Fever all through the night.
In 1966, he was sentenced to 8 to 20 years and sent to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He kept writing songs behind those walls. He even performed for other inmates. Friends like James Brown and Aretha Franklin reportedly made the long trip out to Walla Walla just to see him.
'Cause I know you're gonna treat me right, you give me fever.
On May 26, 1968, Little Willie John died inside that prison. He was only 30 years old. His official death certificate listed the cause as a heart attack, but rumors of neglect and mistreatment in that prison hospital have followed his death for decades.
And just believing what my lips have to say, you give me.
He wouldn't be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame until 1996, 28 years after he died behind bars, having never had the chance to perform Fever as a free man again.
'Cause I know you're gonna treat me right, you give me fever.
Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 7, Frankie Lyman. Frankie Lyman was 13 years old when Why Do Fools Fall in Love hit number 1. 13. He was the first black teen idol in American pop music, fronting Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. 5 kids from Harlem who somehow became the biggest doo-wop act in the country, headlining the Apollo Theater and touring London's Palladium before most of them could legally drive. And then, almost as fast as it began, it fell apart. By 15, Frankie had been introduced to heroin. The hits stopped, the group split. His voice, the very thing that made him a star, cracked and changed as he grew older, and the labels that once fought over him stopped calling. What followed was over a decade of addiction, arrests, and failed comeback attempts. In 1966, he was arrested for heroin possession and joined the Army instead of going to jail. For nearly 3 years, he stayed clean. He met a school teacher named Amira Eagle, married her, and seemed to be putting his life back together. In February 1968, Frankie traveled to New York for what looked like a real second chance. A new label deal, a recording session booked for the very next morning to relaunch his career. He stayed at his grandmother's apartment in Harlem, the same building he'd grown up in. He never made it to that session. On the morning of February 27, 1968, Frankie Lyman was found dead on his grandmother's bathroom floor, a syringe beside him. He had relapsed to celebrate his comeback and overdosed within hours. He was 25 years old, buried in an unmarked grave, with the very record label rights to his biggest hit tangled up in a lawsuit that would outlive him by decades. Number 6, Donny Hathaway.
I've sung a lot of songs.
Donny Hathaway's voice could carry a song the way few voices ever have. A piano prodigy out of St. Louis, classically trained with a gift for arrangement that left other singers in awe of him.
I made some bad rhymes.
His duets with Roberta Flack, Where Is the Love, The Closer I Get to You, gave them both Grammy-winning, chart-topping hits.
Now, and I'm singing this song to you.
His own song, This Christmas, recorded in 1970, has become one of the most played holiday soul records of all time, decade after decade. What most of his fans didn't know was that behind that voice, Donny was fighting a private war with severe mental illness.
There's no one more important to me.
Friends and family later confirmed he battled paranoid schizophrenia for years, an illness that came with deep depression, hospital stays, and periods where he simply disappeared from public life entirely.
But now I'm so much better.
By 1977, he and Roberta Flack reconciled after years apart and started working on a second duet album together. The Closer I Get to You became a massive hit. It looked, on the outside, like Donny Hathaway was finally back.
Listen to the man.
On January 13th, 1979, Donny was in a New York studio recording with producers for that new album when, according to those in the room, he began acting erratically. The session was cut short and Donny left. Hours later, he was found dead outside the Essex House Hotel, having fallen from the window of his 15th floor room.
I love you, then I'm late.
His death was ruled a suicide by the coroner, though to this day, his family and many of his closest friends maintain they believe it may have been a tragic accident, pointing to his habit of opening windows to sing into the night air.
I love you.
Donny Hathaway was only 33 years old. In 2019, 40 years after his death, the Recording Academy finally honored him with a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, recognition that came decades too late for a man many musicians still consider one of the greatest vocalists soul music ever produced. Number 5, Tammi Terrell.
If you need me, call me, no matter where you are.
For exactly 12 months, starting in April 1967, Tammi Terrell and Marvin Gaye were untouchable. Ain't no mountain high enough, Your Precious Love. Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing.
No matter how far.
Don't worry, baby.
3 of the greatest duets in Motown history, all cut in barely a year, all from a singer who was just 22 years old. Tammi had been having migraines since childhood. Headaches she mostly kept to herself, brushing them off as nothing.
Don't have to worry, 'cause baby, there ain't no
On October 14th, 1967, while performing Your Precious Love with Marvin on stage at Hampton-Sydney College in Virginia, the pain became too much.
I'm getting to you, baby.
She collapsed mid-song, straight into Marvin Gaye's arms in front of the entire audience. Doctors found a malignant tumor growing in the right side of her brain. What followed was almost unimaginable. 8 separate surgeries over the next 2.5 years, each one chipping away at her, none of them able to stop the disease. Motown kept releasing Marvin and Tammi duets through it all. Some assembled from vocals she'd recorded before her diagnosis, just to keep the hits coming while she fought for her lot behind the scenes.
If you ever need a helping hand,
By 1969, Tammi could no longer tour. Her final public appearance came that year at the Apollo Theater, where Marvin Gaye spotted her in the crowd, pulled her up on stage, and the two of them sang You're All I Need to Get By Together one last time to a standing ovation. By early 1970, the cancer had taken her eyesight and her hair, and she weighed barely 93 pounds. After her 8th and final surgery in January 1970, Tammi slipped into a coma. She died on March 16, 1970, just over a month shy of her 25th birthday. Marvin Gaye delivered her eulogy himself, and friends say he never fully recovered from her death. Grief that helped push him toward the album that would define the rest of his career, What's Going On? Number 4, Otis Redding. In December 1967, Otis Redding had just done something extraordinary. 3 days earlier, in a Memphis studio with guitarist Steve Cropper, he'd recorded a song unlike anything he'd done before.
but when she gets weary,
Softer, more reflective, almost nothing like the explosive soul shouting that made him famous. It was called Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. He never got to see what it would become.
you know
Otis was 26 and at the absolute peak of his powers. His Monterey Pop Festival performance that June had electrified an entire new audience of fans who'd never heard soul music delivered with that kind of raw force. He'd bought his own twin-engine plane to keep up with his packed touring schedule, flying himself and his young backing band, the Barkays, from city to city.
she had her grief and care.
On December 10th, 1967, that plane took off from Cleveland, heading to a show in Madison, Wisconsin. The weather was foggy and rough.
It's not.
As the plane made its final approach to the airport, something went catastrophically wrong, and it plunged straight into the icy water of Lake Monona, just miles short of the runway.
Some girls, they don't forget it.
Otis Redding was killed instantly, along with 4 members of the Barkays: Phelan Jones, Ronnie Caldwell, Carl Cunningham, and Jimmy King. plus his teenage valet and the pilot. Only one person on that plane survived. Trumpet player Ben Cawley, who couldn't even swim, somehow made it out of the wreckage alive while everyone around him didn't. Less than a month later, Clyde, Sitting On, The Dock of the Bay, was released. It became Otis Redding's only #1 hit, the first posthumous #1 single in American chart history. He never got to hear it on the radio. Number 3, Jackie Wilson. Jackie Wilson earned the nickname Mr. Excitement, honestly. 4-octave vocal range, a stage performance so electric it directly influenced Elvis Presley, James Brown, and Michael Jackson. Songs like Lonely Teardrops and Higher and Higher made him one of the defining voices of early soul. Off stage, though, Jackie was being financially destroyed by the very people managing his career. His manager and label, Brunswick Records, were later found by courts to have defrauded him out of royalties, at one point owing him as much as $1 million, while the IRS seized his house for unpaid taxes he never should have owed in the first place. On September 29, 1975, Jackie was performing on a Dick Clark Oldies Revue at the Latin Casino in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. He was singing the very song that made him famous, Lonely Teardrops, reportedly right as he hit the line about his heart, when he suffered a massive heart attack and collapsed, striking his head hard on the stage floor. He survived, but the damage to his brain from the fall and the attack left him in a state of permanent, near-total incapacitation. Jackie Wilson spent the next 8 years unable to walk, unable to perform, unable to live independently, first in hospitals, then in a nursing home, his family fighting bitter legal battles over his care the entire time. He never woke up enough to know that in 1984, Michael Jackson stood on stage at the Grammy Awards and dedicated his Album of the Year win for Thriller to him. On January 21, 1984, Jackie Wilson finally died in that Mount Holly, New Jersey nursing home. He was 49 years old, buried in an unmarked grave, a final quiet insult after a lifetime of being underpaid for his genius. Fans later raised the money to give him a proper memorial. Number 2, Sam Cooke.
I was born by the river.
Sam Cooke didn't just sing soul music. He basically invented the commercial template for it, walking away from gospel stardom with the soul stirrers to chase a pop career that turned him into one of the first black artists to own his own record label and publishing company.
In a little tent. Oh.
You Send Me, Chain Gang, Cupid, A Change Is Gonna Come. A song so powerful it became an anthem of the entire civil rights movement, released right as Cooke's life was ending. On the night of December 11, 1964, Sam Cooke was at a Los Angeles restaurant called Martoni's when he met a young woman named Elisa Boyer. What happened over the next several hours has never been fully agreed upon. Boyer would later testify that Cooke drove her against her will to the Hacienda Motel and forced her into a room.
And just like the river I've been running.
Cooke's friends and family have always disputed major parts of her account. What's certain is this: sometime after midnight, Boyer fled the motel room, and Sam Cooke ended up at the office of the motel's manager, Bertha Franklin, wearing only a sport coat and one shoe, demanding to know where the woman had gone. A struggle followed. Franklin shot Cooke 3 times. He was dead before police even arrived. The shooting was ruled a justifiable homicide within days, in a hearing so rushed that Cooke's own attorney was reportedly allowed to ask only a single question.
Then I go to my brother.
To this day, friends who saw his body at the open casket funeral, including Etta James, who said the injuries looked far worse than a single confrontation could explain, have questioned whether the official story tells the whole truth.
Somebody keep telling.
Sam Cooke was only 33 years old. Roughly 200,000 fans turned out across Los Angeles and Chicago to mourn him. A Change Is Gonna Come was released 11 days after his death and has remained one of the most important songs in American history ever since.
Oh, yes, it will.
Number 1. Marvin Gaye.
There's too many of you crying.
Marvin Gaye gave Motown its conscience. What's Going On? Mercy, Mercy Me. Sexual Healing. He moved from the label's most reliable hit maker into one of the most fearless, boundary-pushing artists of his generation, all while privately carrying a childhood wound that never healed. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., was a Pentecostal minister who raised Marvin under a brutal, rigid moral code, one that biographers and family members alike have described as abusive.
We don't need to escalate.
The tension between father and son never went away, even as Marvin became one of the most famous musicians on the planet.
Pick it side. Punish.
By the early 1980s, Marvin was struggling badly with cocaine addiction, paranoia, and depression. Convinced he needed protection, he had his bodyguard give his own father a .38 revolver in late 1983, a decision that would prove catastrophic. Marvin moved back into his parents' house in Los Angeles, and the two men spent months locked in escalating conflict, barely able to stay in the same rooms. On April 1st, 1984, one day before Marvin's 45th birthday, another argument broke out between his parents. Marvin stepped in to defend his mother, and the fight turned physical between father and son. After Marvin's mother separated them and sent Marvin back to his room, Marvin Sr. walked upstairs, picked up the gun his own son had given him for safety, shot Marvin Gaye in the chest at close range. He fired a second shot moments later. Marvin was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital.
People, you know,
His father pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter and received a suspended sentence with probation, having claimed self-defense. More than 10,000 mourners attended Marvin's funeral, including Berry Gordy, Little Richard, and both of his ex-wives.
so you can see what's going.
The man who once sang Mercy, Mercy Me, a man whose music asked the world to be gentler with itself, was killed in his childhood bedroom by the one person whose approval he spent his entire life trying to earn.
What's going on? Wanna know what's going on?
10 voices, 10 lives that ended in ways their fans never saw coming. But every single one of those records is still out there right now, exactly as powerful as the day it was recorded. Which one of these stories hit you the hardest? Let me know in the comments and tell me which artist you think deserves a full deep dive of their own. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more of these stories still to tell.
Woo!